Hello and welcome to episode 2 of GDP, Gross Domestic Provocation. I'm Jeremy Hudson and I'm here as usual with two of the smartest people I know, hedge fund trader Jason Freeman.
Hello, Palace Slayer.
And economist Dan Altman.
Muy buenos dias from the United States of America and sometimes Argentina as well.
Any relation to Sam Altman, by the way?
None at all, which means I can't call him up and ask for, a nice yacht.
That is a shame for many reasons, especially because today we're going to talk about AI. Obviously, AI has affected everyone's lives over the past couple of years to varying degrees. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do this podcast without a bit of AI help for the music and the imagery and stuff like that. But AI has been around for decades, actually. Back in the day, AI was more rules-based and used to find patterns in data. Actually, about 25 years ago, I was visiting the US. Actually, Jason, you might have been there with me. I was buying some underwear in Century 21, if you guys know that store in New York. It was $10, but my card got declined. Just a little embarrassing. Anyway, that was a form of AI that spotting that was outside my usual spending pattern. So then AI progressed to things like recommending what shows to watch on Netflix and Facebook recognizing friends in photos and tagging them. The big difference in AI nowadays is that it doesn't just analyze things anymore, it actually generates content like text, images, and video, hence the term generative AI. And this huge change has led to a lot of hype and money being invested into AI, so much so that some people are saying that we're in an AI bubble. So the question we want to answer today is whether we're in an AI bubble or not. So first of all, what do we actually mean by a bubble? Jason?
The term bubble has always been bandied around in mainstream media, especially in relation to finance. So what it really refers to is a financial and commodities bubble, when essentially the price of something goes up and up and up and up and up over a period of time, not really because of its intrinsic value, but because people who buy it expect to be able to sell it again at a profit. So it can sometimes be described as almost like a buying frenzy or buying mania. And it's normally specifically around financial assets and commodities. So, I mean, rather than wax lyrically about definitions, it's probably best up to maybe dive into history as a good guide. So one of the ones which has been always noted in financial lexicon is the tulip mania bubble in the 17th century.
Like the flower, tulip.
Yes, the flower.
Oh, really? Okay.
The bulb, not even the actual flower.
Oh, the bulb. Okay.
So it's a classic because it's widely considered the first recorded financial bubble and occurred during the Dutch Golden Age in Holland during the 1630s. So what really happened is that speculation, and I can't remember the exact kind of cultural specifics around why particular rare bulbs got such massive demand, but speculation drove up tulip bulb value to as much as 6 times the average person's annual salary. And then some stories at the time suggest that some even rarer bulbs soared to the cost of like a grand canal-side mansion in Amsterdam, if you've ever visited there. So you can imagine how impressive that was. So it just illustrates the extreme nature of market frenzy. And in that particular episode, prices did eventually collapse, but it didn't really have any significant damage or impact on the Dutch economy. But it did lead to a big cultural shock, impacted social relations and reliability of credit at the time. So it's kind of one of the first widely recorded because of the time it happened in the 17th century. But again, there's still kind of varying stories of how impactful it was. So one other pertinent one from history had much more actual relevance was the South Sea bubble of 1720. And that was a major financial crash in London. And that's much more of a pertinent example of financial boom and bust. And then it's that financial boom and bust that's kind of associated with bubbles because it happens so quickly. So that had more consequences that led to an actual direct economic crisis in the UK, and that almost ruined the finances of the country and the economy at the time. But what it also had, and that's kind of what other more modern bubbles have a feature of, it has consequential knock-on effects. So it actually precipitated a crash in the Paris Stock Exchange, known as the Mississippi bubble. So you had 2 big financial centers in Europe, which are both interlinked in crisis. So it had effects beyond the London market. But that's just kind of like a rough guide of in terms of just sort of more ancient history, but more recent history in terms of how we look at these.
Got it. Actually, Dan, do you have any more recent examples?
Yeah, sure. I thought we were going to discuss your underwear buying habits, but if you want to go
That could
back
be
to
another
bubble,
episode.
yeah, all right, fair enough. The Great Depression was precipitated in part by a bubble in the stock market in the United States. And again, similar to what Jason was talking about, this was a case where the prices of stocks on the stock exchange just escaped from any notion of what their fundamental value was. Their prices were just being driven by demand and this expectation that they could be sold at a higher price someday in the future as more people were flooding into the market. And then it becomes kind of a Ponzi scheme, right? Because for those prices to keep going up, you need more and more people to get into the market and want to buy stocks. But the moment that collapses, it's just like a castle in the air. There's nothing holding it up. It's kind of like Wile E. Coyote.
Sounds a bit like crypto.
Yeah, well, crypto, maybe. But, it's like Wile E. Coyote when he notices that he's floating in the air and there's nothing below him in the cartoons, if I'm not showing my age too much by citing Wile E. Coyote. But, that's essentially what happened. But in the United States during the Great Depression, we also had a weak financial system. The economy was heading into recession, and it all kind of balled up together into one horrendous episode. We could add in the trade policies and tariffs of that time as well. Even more recently, we've had the dot-com bubble, which again was this case of the prices really escaping from any notion of fundamental value. Some of it was timing. The economy wasn't necessarily ready for some of the huge investments that went into internet firms and even the infrastructure like fiber optic cables, which later on would actually turn out to be useful. But essentially, a lot of these prices just made no rational sense if you actually looked at the money that these companies could possibly earn. And so we had that crash. And more recently, we had the subprime mortgage crisis, which was a kind of bubble in itself because it led to extremely high property prices that were really not warranted in places like Florida. So we've had a couple bubbles recently, and when you look at any currency or share price or any financial asset where the prices are just being driven by demand much more than any fundamental usage or utility, then you have that danger of a bubble.
That sounds like a very apt description of the crypto market.
Another mention of crypto. Amazing. Yeah. I did some research for my newsletter, the High Yield Economics newsletter recently, where I was actually looking at how many people use Bitcoin, not just hold Bitcoin, but actually use it for transactions. And it's a tiny minority. And so you got to ask yourself, if almost nobody's actually using this stuff, how does it maintain this high value?
It's probably in demand for international drug lords. It can't really use it to go down the shop to buy eggs, I suppose. So I guess by the time you walk to the shops, it might be up or down 10%. So it's not really that viable. But I guess we're kind of digressing. But I mean, the one thing I'd note from our historic descriptions of bubbles is that the commonality is that no one really acknowledged that there were bubbles until the actual bust part of the cycle of the whole thing happened, right? So I think that's one key takeaway to recognize from all of this.
Yeah, it's an emperor has no clothes type of situation.
Yeah, certainly.
Great. So bringing this back to AI. So obviously some of these companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, they're huge now. So I'm curious, how large has generative AI actually grown as part of the economy in the stock market? Dan?
Well, as the economy goes, it's not growing as fast as some people might suggest. The economists and technologists who've examined how much companies are actually integrating AI have found that it's not necessarily expanding any faster than other technological revolutions that we've seen in the recent past, like mobile telephony or personal computers or the use of the internet. That doesn't mean it won't be influential. I mean, all those things turned out to be extremely influential. It just didn't really happen overnight. And we've seen some studies suggesting that a lot of AI integrations don't end up being very profitable for companies. So people are still kind of getting the hang of how to do this. I think you also have to remember that a lot of the economy can't really use generative AI very much. You think of about half of the workforce doing what we call standing jobs, or some people call them blue-collar jobs, but essentially jobs where you're doing physical activity. And about 40% of jobs require what our Bureau of Labor Statistics calls medium-level physical demands, which means constantly moving objects, stuff like that. Generative AI is probably less useful than regular AI for making those jobs more efficient. And so it's not clear that it can impact that vast swath of the labor market. But, the other thing that always springs to mind for me when I talk about generative AI is that it seems like a productivity tool above all. I don't know if it's going to change fundamentally how the labor market works. I saw a prediction the other day on LinkedIn, a woman named Alana Gold. I don't really know what she does, but she had a popular post saying that 90% of sales jobs were going to disappear in the next 2 years. I mean, that's 13 million jobs in the US. I just can't really imagine that happening, even in a 2 year period, because of generative AI. So there's a lot of hype, and I think some of it's overstated.
Well, I mean, because obviously you look at this stuff more than I do, but then is there any kind of reliable productivity data in the US? I mean, if we look at ChatGPT, I think it came online in November 2022, roughly. So since then, it's grown to maybe like 800 million weekly users. There's 2.5 million messages processed every day. So, I mean, that growth is unparalleled versus, other adoptions of technology, internet, etc. So, I mean, has there been any improvement in productivity data or stats? Or
Great question. Another post I saw recently was from Martha Gimbel, who's the director of the Budget Lab at Yale, which does a lot of economic forecasting and estimates of costs of different programs and policies. And she said something to the effect of, damn, why did generative AI have to boom? Literally the most difficult time for figuring out its impact on productivity. And I think the reason she said that was when we're coming through a very weird economic cycle, still in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this very unusual labor market where we have low unemployment and low churn and kind of stagnation, it's very difficult because there are a lot of different things that can affect productivity. At times like this, we tend to see companies demanding more from their existing workers rather than hiring new workers. And that creates a sort of artificial bump in productivity, but it can't be sustained for very long. And so if we're looking for something like the late 90s boom in productivity that came from mobile telephony and the internet, it's going to take a little while for the dust to clear before we can really tell if that's happening.
Oh, that's interesting. So yeah, to follow into your questions, I think the growth in the underlying use of apps like ChatGPT and AI agents, that has been very much reflected in financial markets. There was some recent research from one of the investment banks, I believe it was JP Morgan, that identified 41 AI-related stocks. I mean, it's hard to necessarily define that as a theme, but I think they've made some effort to do that. And that now accounts in terms of market cap for 45% of the S&P 500, and that's up from
Really?
28% from when ChatGPT first came online. So if you actually look at the market gains, obviously we're in a bit of a bull market now in terms of like overall stock market and the individual AI stocks itself. Those 41 stocks out of the 500 stocks have accounted for 70% of the increase in the S&P 500's value from that time. So again, if we're comparing that to historic frenzies or tulip mania and stuff like that, I mean, that it would imply that there is some sort of momentum in terms of describing this as a bubble, and that's obviously increased in the last few weeks. The darling of the AI sector is NVIDIA, which basically makes a lot of the chips and the infrastructure for the entire space. And NVIDIA is now the largest company in the world by quite some distance. But now that's actually 8% of the overall S&P 500. So if you look at these metrics in isolation, you would have some cause to fear that a bubble is forming or is in the process of.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that 45% probably includes Google or Alphabet as well, since they're into AI, but they have other businesses too. But the growth number is very impressive. I mean, 70% of the growth coming from those stocks, that has to be associated with this. And that does sound a little bubbly.
For listeners who are less aware of how the market structure works, most invested money is either actively or passively managed. There's been a trend, especially since COVID, for the passive management to actually overtake the number of assets managed globally versus active. So active management would be a portfolio manager, very traditional setup, picking a bunch of stocks and other instruments to outperform a particular benchmark, which might be something like the S&P 500. What's happened in the last 5 years especially is that many institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard have their own passive products which replicate the index. In general, now this sector of the market is now larger than the active side of it. So in the US, you have a lot of money that flows from 401k flows into these passive funds, and automatically they have to replicate and buy the index, which is obviously now dominated by these AI stocks. So it's not necessarily the source of the bubble, but if there is a bubble, but it's obviously helping contribute to grow it.
Got it. So what justifies these high share prices for Gen AI related stocks? Is it profitability, productivity, or even something else?
Well, if you look at a company like NVIDIA, they're selling chips. I mean, they're building widgets and selling them as quickly as they can. It's not a guarantee that all of their future orders will conform to forecasts, but they actually have a product and they have revenue and profits. Then you have all of the Gen AI companies that are supplying large language models and that kind of text generation, image generation that lots of people are using. Their revenues are growing, but they're still extremely small relative to the amount of money that they've raised. Now, lots of people will buy a promise. There have been big companies that have been very successful that didn't make profit for a long time, like Amazon. I can remember sitting in meetings when I was working at The Economist back in 2000 or 2001 and having Chris Anderson, who went on to be the editor of Wired, saying, hey, Amazon is actually a great business. It's going to make money. It's going to do fine. You know, it's just growing its market, the flywheel. And there were a lot of skeptical people sitting in the room saying, come on, it's never made a profit. How is this a good company? So it can happen, but it does take time. And again, timing can be an issue because if those profits start to disappoint and it takes a lot longer than the market has expected, then we're going to see a crash in these values. But overall, you know, the revenue for these leading generative AI companies is growing at rates that are pretty typical of other tech startups, especially ones that have had a long incubation of 5 or 7 years. And so, you know, it's not that different. It's just that they're so much bigger as a share of the market individually. And I do expect productivity to increase, and that'll give more credence to some of these predictions about how the adoption and integration of Gen AI is going to be useful. But it's not clear that it's happening any faster, as I said before. And I don't know if it's going to have the same degree of change in our lives as personal computers or mobile phones or the internet, because even, as I said, in a lot of standing jobs, those things make a difference, and they make a difference to people's everyday lives. This seems like it might be not quite as broadly effective through the economy, but we'll see.
Well, that's a very good point, Dan. I think as well, I remember working, I think I was in investment banking back then when we had that dot-com bubble. But I do remember, again, we were working in asset management then. So the darlings of the tech boom then were, you know, not the eventual long-term winners of the whole tech hegemony. So I think it was like companies like Cisco. I mean, obviously they're still around today, but Cisco, Juniper, they haven't expanded and become as profitable as your Amazons or Google, Meta, and that sort of stuff. So it's even a differentiation between winners and losers at the beginning of the cycle versus what actually happens towards the end of the cycle. But one aspect of which has gained more attention, especially in the US in the last few months, is the actual electricity usage that a lot of the data centers being built to facilitate the diffusion of AI through society actually uses. So OpenAI itself is going to require 250 gigawatts of electricity to actually fulfill its commitments going forward to 2028. So those data centers will actually give you an idea of scale. And that's just OpenAI as one company itself. That 250 gigawatts of electricity would require one of these three options, which would be 250 nuclear power plants, 23 kilometers squared of solar panels, which is basically the size of New Jersey.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's insane. Or 57 large gas power plants. So the scale of actual spend on electricity infrastructure required to actually fulfill the data centers that have been committed to be built in the next 2 to 3 years is really hard to kind of envisage, especially when you have a current administration which is cutting a lot of clean energy products, which is going to take away a lot of capacity from the grid anyway. Really, it's maybe not the case that we're in a bubble because of the valuations themselves, but it's maybe the actual bottleneck for AI is not going to be the actual technology; it's going to be electricity. In a world where electricity is costing more and more.
Yeah, and when we think about that enormous capital investment, as we talked about in the last episode, somebody's going to have to finance all that stuff, and that's really going to keep rates higher at the end of the curve. And that's going to make it harder for mortgage rates to come down, credit card rates, car loan rates. This bubble is having effects on real people, even if they're not in the stock market.
Yes, and I think that there's pushback from some people within the US as well, whether it's just consumers, because wherever they open an AI data center currently, electricity usage and water usage to cool down the servers is expanding exponentially. So I think Google tried to open one in Indiana recently, and the public got together and have stopped them from going ahead and doing that. But that's going to be another kind of debate in terms of like what's the final usage versus the amount of electricity it consumes. And I think that debate's only really starting now in terms of the benefit of society.
Yeah, the data center controversy, I think it's in a lot of parts of the US. I mean, they're building them right next to people's houses and, you can literally hear them and, obviously the water usage and all that. I think we forget sometimes that just asking ChatGPT, where should I buy my underwear from in New York, that actually requires quite a lot of processing power, electricity and water.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
it does.
think like anecdotally, to follow on to that point, is like Sam Altman. I think at some point earlier this year, when he was like cruising over some sort of results from the company, said he requested users to stop saying thank you to the AI agent because it burnt through too much electricity and cost him millions every time everybody did. So that in itself is probably kind of a worrying anecdote, right? So I think like one final point on that aspect of it all is that like, I mean, for our listeners, there are instruments which kind of replicate the real estate exposures within the US called REITs. So they're real estate investment trusts. Currently, at the moment, there are more data centers being built in the US than there is overall office construction, which is a pretty insane stat in itself. But if you look within that sector of data center construction and the REITs which are available for that particular sector, they're the worst performing in the US. So they're down in terms of year-to-date return 9.5%. So if the real estate sector itself is telling you that the data center hype itself is not necessarily profitable, then that has more worries for the broader sector, I think.
Got it. So I'd love to talk about what's happening in the market right now. One thing I've been seeing is like these deals between NVIDIA, OpenAI, and Oracle. What's all that about?
I don't think anyone knows. I think there's the financial architecture and accounting around a lot of these deals are very complicated because you have a lot of deals that have been signed recently which seem very circular between Oracle and NVIDIA, OpenAI, and a bunch of other like players within the market. So the FT tried to even like kind of unravel it a few weeks ago, and it came a very complex diagram and flow chart of like the various relationships within the space, and it looks like me figuring out my fantasy football team just 2 hours before match day in my head with all the lines and pointers everywhere. But it's multiple governments, it's multiple institutions, it's people involved in cloud, it's Meta, it's Oracle. One thing is clear that once these deals do get announced, the stocks involved generally get their share price boosted. So not to be cynical, that may be one aspect of it. But we're not going to know until the dust settles exactly where all the circular financing has actually ended up at. So.
Yeah, it's very unusual what's going on right now in the markets because you have kind of I wouldn't call it a mafia or a cabal, but you have kind of a very small group of people who are determining the valuations of these enormous firms with millions of investors. And we saw sort of a preview of it with Elon Musk and what he did with deals between X and Tesla and SpaceX in recent times. He's got one struggling asset in X, and then Tesla with his enormous price earnings ratios, which might be in a bubble itself, and then SpaceX, which seems like it might be the most reliably profitable of his companies. And they're all doing deals between each other to somehow prop up the value of all three companies and make sure that the investors who put up money for them are going to get paid. I don't think that it's quite to the same degree of hiding dangers with these AI companies, because I think that there's probably less valuation in those Musk companies than he'd like us to believe. But between these companies, there's a lot you can do to sort of boost and disguise valuations with these deals. And when I was in grad school, we used to talk about, for example, Korean or German conglomerates as being completely opaque in terms of their ownership structures, where, Porsche would own part of Volkswagen, but Volkswagen would own part of Porsche, and then the half of each company would be owned by a different bank, and there would be a holding company that owned both banks. And it was just crazy. And you couldn't tell what the stock price should be for these companies by trying to sort through all of this. And we're entering a situation like that now, but we're entering it with these companies that, as Jason said, are taking up a huge amount of the value of major share indices. And so that by itself creates some risk, a risk that we really haven't seen since the explosion of derivatives markets activities in 2001, 2002, which led to corporate scandals like Enron and WorldCom.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned Enron like that, because I know just speaking to people who kind of do this more for a living in terms of like being analysts, it seems to be a lot of the stuff that's going on in terms of the accounting practices for all these companies, and especially this particular cabal of AI related stocks, is that it reminds them of Enron double counting of revenues and that sort of thing that happened at that time in the dot-com era. So there's so many kind of aspects to this, where history repeats itself, right? Where we're seeing this kind of behavior at this part of the cycle. So I mean, that in itself doesn't necessarily mean it's a bubble, but it's obviously something that we need to keep an eye on. And I think the bubble lexicon seems to be, if you look at kind of Google searches, that seems to be much more in the public conscience the last few months. And I think that's a lot more sparked by a few more prominent people within the space itself and within finance actually talking about the sector as a bubble. So I think we had maybe a few weeks ago, Jeff Bezos was giving a kind of TED talk or maybe some sort of interview. And he said he believes that AI is in an industrial bubble, which means every type of company or experiment, whether it's good or bad, will get funded. And even if investors don't make money, it will probably change every industry in the long term, similar to what the dot-com boom did anyway. And I think one example that he used was actually a very good one, where he said the biotech bubble in the 1990s, investors lost a lot of money, then society eventually gained a number of life-saving drugs. So you could actually look at the technology and the underlying momentum and usage and pick up within society is obviously still going to be very beneficial, but in the current form of it, in terms of the actual financial plumbing of it, may be overvalued.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of big names coming out saying it might be a bubble. Ken Griffin as well at Citadel and Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase. There was even an op-ed in the New York Times today, the day of our recording, by a guy named Jared Bernstein, who was head of the Council of Economic Advisors for the Biden administration and one of his colleagues at Stanford. He's a fiscal policy guy. I mean, there's a famous clip of him being asked about monetary policy and the money supply, where he can't even really answer basic questions about monetary policy. And now he's writing an op-ed in the Times saying that there's a bubble in the stock market. I mean, this is like the guy you least want to hear about when it comes to a financial bubble. So it's kind of like there's a bubble. There's a bubble of people talking about bubbles.
Yes. I think to add to that, I think I saw the Bank of England, again, not to be the most reliable of predictors of economic activity. I think they put out some report that like they saw like a bubble forming in various tech stocks of AI. I think IMF may have said something similar this week. But again, as Dan pointed out, it just seems like there's a bubble of people talking about there being a bubble. And it's a lot of people are just sort of jumping on the bandwagon. So not necessarily a sign in itself.
So on that note, let's chat about what's coming next and what all this means for our listeners.
Well, I think inevitably there's going to be a watershed. As Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. So, if the tide goes out in terms of other economic shocks, then we'll see some crash or some sort of popping of the bubble, and we'll find out which are good companies and which aren't, which part of this is just, like I said before, essentially a Ponzi scheme.
Okay, so guys, what's the bottom line? Jason?
Well, I mean, I don't want to predict a bubble popping and not popping. Yeah, I think as we discussed, it's so hard to identify these things when they're forming at the tops of when they form. It's generally when they burst it happens. But I think if it does happen, it's probably going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. And in terms of looking at what happened in the dot-com bubble, ultimately it was healthier for society. I mean, we've got rid of a lot of the kind of froth that was involved in financial markets. Resource and investment flowed to those companies that actually benefited from the diffusion of technology in society. It's helped society on the whole. So the technology, the underlying aspects of technology does. But then I guess from what we have pointed out towards the end is that this is definitely going to have an impact on the structure of jobs, the structure of the job market, and it's going to have an immediate impact versus these other technologies. So there's going to be quite a lot of balls to juggle, even if it is a bubble and it doesn't pop. There's going to be big sociological and demographic impacts from it.
From an economic perspective, I'd say we're in some pretty dangerous moments for the next several months as well. If we do see the bubble popping, that's likely to take a big chunk out of consumer spending in the United States and other countries. And so we could see some of these economies tipping into recession. That could lead us further down the road where companies say, okay, if we're in a recession, I need to do more with less, and I'm going to rely on these AI tools even more. We could see, as we usually do, a productivity push coming out of the recession that could turn into a more durable productivity boom like we saw in the late 90s. And that's always the best of all possible worlds because you get higher productivity, so you get incomes rising without a lot of inflation, you get economic growth, you can start paying off your debts, things like that, things that a lot of major economies need to do, as we mentioned in our last episode. But that's really the Goldilocks scenario, and I just think that there's no guarantee we're going to get such a great scenario. Right now, we've got to worry more about what these valuations really ought to be.
And I guess the thing is as well that, like, in kind of linking this to what we talked about last week, is that you have to look at the overall economic and geopolitical backdrop as to what's happening now, potentially this bubble versus the dot-com bubble. Like, the US economy, the global economy is in a very different situation then. Inflation was more under control. You had much more clear independent central bank mandates. And debt to GDP wasn't necessarily an issue, like in terms of you look at Western developed economies. So if you have a bubble of this magnitude now popping in terms of its overall effect on the stock market, in terms of the concentration risk, in terms of the S&P, which is basically now the S&P gains is responsible from this one theme, that can have a big knock-on effect in terms of unemployment numbers, what the Fed does, how quickly they cut rates. And they'll be cutting rates into an already potentially inflationary environment from tariffs and commodity prices going up. So there's a lot of more potential knock-on and contagion effects versus the dot-com bubble bursting, I think, this time around with this bubble bursting now, if it does.
All right. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Please give us some feedback on what topics you want to hear about in future episodes in the comment section, and see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.